Welcome to this new episode of the WTO Trade Dialogues on Food, entitled Improved Seed Trade, Unlocking Global Food Security. Welcome to our very distinguished panel, and welcome to our viewers. My name is Doa Abdelmotan. I'm Senior Counselor in the WTO Agriculture and Commodities Division, and I'll be moderating today's debate. I'll put 2 rounds of questions to our panelists, after which I'll open the floor to you, the viewers, for questions. Please feel free to send me your questions at dialogues@wto.org. I'd like to begin by providing some context for today's webinar. In recent episodes of the Trade Dialogues on Food, we explored the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and subsequently the tensions in the Black Sea region on food security. We looked at food and fertilizer in particular. What we have never looked at so far are seeds. And of course, without seeds, there can be no global food security. So the purpose of this episode is twofold. One, to look at the impact of these multiple crises on trade in seeds, availability and access to seeds, and 2, to gain a better understanding of how the WTO rulebook can facilitate global trade in seeds. There are, of course, multiple points of intersection between our rulebook and trade in seeds, all the way from the classic market access issues like tariffs and subsidies to intellectual property, sanitary and phytosanitary measures, and much more. This episode also comes on the heels of the WTO's 12th Ministerial Conference, in which some important decisions on food security were taken. And with us today is the Director of the WTO's Agriculture and Commodities Division, Edwini Kessi, who will walk us through some of these breakthroughs. Now, just a few introductory words on trade in seeds before I give the floor to our very distinguished panel. At the global level, according to the International Seed Federation, approximately 7 million metric tons of seeds are imported every year to the tune of US $14 billion. This is not a minor sector, therefore, of world trade. It's a sector that is vital to global agriculture and to world trade. And the sector has suffered as a result of recent crises, prompting the International Seed Federation to call upon policymakers to avoid disruptions to agricultural value chains and to designate the seed sector as, I quote, essential business critical infrastructure, unquote. Clearly, it's of great importance that the global seed supply chain remain truly global. The benefits of this globalization include, first, an expanded market, leading to lower seed development costs. This is because new varieties are often developed for specific climatic conditions. In a global seed supply chain, such varieties can be sold to more countries with similar conditions. The global seed supply chain also leads to increased efficiency. With global seed supply chains, companies can choose to breed their varieties in one country, treat their seeds in another country, and produce hybrid seeds in yet a third country, benefiting from local conditions for greatest efficiency. The globalization of the R&D process itself is a boost to the efficiency of this sector. The global seed supply chain can also lead to greater seed diversification and to a stability of supply. And finally, a global seed supply chain delivers environmental benefits. The access to high-quality seeds can enable farmers to use less land to produce the same amount of food or feed. All of this, of course, increases global food security. With me today is a very distinguished panel to discuss this broad nexus of issues. So let me please, without further ado, introduce the panel to you. Maximo Torero is Chief Economist of the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization. Welcome, Maximo. Edwini Kessie is the Director of the Agriculture and Commodities Division of the WTO. Hello, Edwini. Michael Keller is Secretary General of the International Seed Federation. Welcome, Michael. Marco Van Leeuwen is Managing Director of Rick Swan, a vegetable breeding company that develops improved plant varieties and sells seeds to vegetable growers all over the world. It's now the #4 vegetable breeding company worldwide. Hello, Marco. Naomi Stevens is Global Policy Advocacy Manager of Bayer Crop Science. Hello, Naomi, joining from Australia at an unseemly hour. And Alice Ingebeer is Lead Access to the Seed Index of the World Benchmarking Alliance. Hello, Alice. So let me now open the floor to the first round of questions. Maximo, I'd like to start with you. Before delving into seeds, can you give us an overview of the current global food security situation? We see that the food price index has started to fall and the dry bulk freight costs have begun to do so too. Are things improving and are we able to get grain out of the Black Sea region? And how well is the Black Sea Grain Initiative brokered by the United Nations working? Over to you, Maximo.
Thank you very much, Doa. Thank you all for this meeting. I think the situation right now is indeed, as you said, the FAO Food Price Index for the 5th consecutive month in August has fallen. However, the index is still 8% higher than its value in August 2021, which was already elevated compared to the same month in 2020. Now, while the world food prices are easing a little bit, still this is reflecting a very high inflation, and the overall inflation also continues to rise. And this is due to several reasons. First, of course, we know that before the war in Ukraine, prices were already increasing because of the recovery plans after COVID-19. And of course, we still had a problem of food access because most vulnerable countries still couldn't afford or were not affording because of the new prices. This was exacerbated by the war in Ukraine. Now, what this means today is that the world is facing a challenge of food access, meaning that many countries and poor populations have a lot of difficulties to afford food due to the high prices. And it's true that the Black Sea Initiative, the Black Sea Grain Initiative, have shown some impact. There is right now around 45% of the grain being moved out is for feed, and 55% is for food. And of those, around 5% goes to low middle income countries in terms of values, and around 20% goes to lower middle income. And the remaining is going to high middle income and high income countries. So yes, there's an improvement in terms of more availability because of the mobility of grains out, and also a marginal improvement in terms of access. But there is a significant challenge still of access to food for the most vulnerable countries. Just to give you an idea, there are two sources through which the mechanics are working to increase the food import bill of countries. One is, of course, the price effect, but the second is also the devaluation effect, the exchange rate effect, because these are net food importers. And those together has increased the food import bill in around $24.5 billion, which is affecting 62 countries and affecting around 1.72 billion people, meaning that these 62 countries is facing significant challenges of balance of payments. And that's why we believe it's really important to complement this very good initiative of the Black Sea with initiatives like the Food Import Financing Facility that we're going to discuss later, that will help to support access to food to these countries. Now, the other important thing that is happening, which is different, is the fertilizer prices, no? And the fertilizer prices were already increasing before the war. This has been exacerbated because of the export restrictions during the war, but also the linkage between natural gas, energy, and fertilizers has exacerbated, and natural gas prices is significantly going up. It has basically by now removed most of the operations of production of nitrogen fertilizer from Europe, Just now, a Yara plant, one of the most energy efficiency plant in Netherlands, has been closed. So this will put a significant challenge even more on the supply of fertilizers, because Europe was an exporter of fertilizers, and now it will become basically potentially a net importer. So we have a big challenge in fertilizer that could affect the next planting season. And of course, this will affect the price of seeds, because you require fertilizer for the production of seeds. So that's the direct link that will be affecting all the input costs for farmers, making it less accessible for the next planting season, and can put us in a possible problem of food availability in addition to food access in the next planting season. So let me stop there and back to you.
Thank you, Maximo, for this. Very clear. So while the food price index is easing a little, it still remains above where it was by 8%. And fertilizer is now one of the principal worries, including for the seed sector. No fertilizer, no seeds. With this, let me turn to you, Michael. Can you give us an overview of the importance of international trade to the seed sector? Who are the main trading nations, and how have you seen international trade in seeds evolve over the years?
Thanks so much, Doa, and thanks so much to put also this the spotlight on seed. And I think what Maximo is saying on fertilized seed, yes, it's important, but it's showing even more the importance of seed and the seed capacity to support farmers. Think global, act local, and serve all farmers in their diversity with diverse, well-adapted, high-quality seed, and provide choice to farmers. This is the mantra we have at the seed sector. And there you can imagine when we speak about achieving sustainable development goals in 2030, when we are hearing increased hunger, when we are hearing these issues for livelihood for farmers, we have a role to play, and we want to play. The diversity of the 8,000 members we have in ISF, that means small, medium, large, local, regional, international companies and cooperatives, and also all the national seed associations acting in over 80 countries around the world, are fully aware and endorsing this mantra. I think the importance of seed trade, just to remind you, in 1924, the traders of Europe and the US met yet. Because why? Because at that time we had no rules. There was no book. And we looked for standards, yet standards to make contracts to trade seed, but also standards to bring quality seed to the farmer. It was about seed testing. In a global seed supply chain, and I think that's very important, from access to genetic resources, to breeding, to production, to trading and marketing, a single seed can cross several countries and even several regions throughout 10 or 12 years. That's a long lap of time. And therefore, you can imagine it's so important for us to have predictable rules and scientifically based rules. Because one thing is important, that's a long process. But at the end, we need to supply the choice of farmer. That means very quickly, perhaps, we have to shift seeds to another country. And therefore, it's so important that we have also this harmonized area on seed. Just 2 or 3 reasons on this increased seed rate. Innovation and breeding, and you mentioned it, Doa. Address yield increase, biotech, biotech stresses, drought. Seeds needs to be adapted locally. It is not a commodity like fertilizers or others. You can move around. It's very important. Stability of supply. Remind us from where we are coming. COVID, we had issues on supply. Therefore, it is so important that seed companies can trial seeds in different countries and also produce seed in different countries. And it's also our capacity to mitigate risk. You saw just flooding in Pakistan. These things are also impacting seed production. Therefore, we need also diversity of places to produce seeds. Then also the biology of crops. It's very important. We cannot produce everywhere the same seed. That's important. Wheat cannot be everywhere. We heard the issues about wheat. And therefore, also, we need countries where we can produce to sell it into other countries. We have also increased efficiency with counter-season production. You see, many things are happening, but it's important. That's showing also seed trade is global. Today, and I think that's the key message we would like to make. Today, no country is fully can fully supply the farmers with seed of their choice solely from their own production. In our statistics, we see 120 countries are importing seeds. I think this is important to remind. Yes, and you mentioned it, Doa, we have around today a value of 16 billion for seed trade. But what is more important, in the last 10 years, this doubled from 8 to 16. This is also showing the importance of the increase of seed trade. I could mention, what are the key countries in terms of seed? Yeah, we could mention the Netherlands, the US, or France, or Germany. But I think what is more important, and this is what we are looking for. We are looking for that you can find vibrant seed sectors in more countries in the world, being part of even exporting seed. Give you 2 examples. Zambia and Vietnam. Vietnam today, 6 times higher export than 10 years back. Zambia, 30 times higher seed export than 10 years back. What is showing this? The regulatory frame is good. That means countries or companies are investing there. Seed production is taking place. This is what we are looking for. We are looking for also in more countries in Africa and elsewhere, we can structure a vibrant seed sector. But for this, we need also the regulatory frame. With this, yeah, we dream of a world where we are leveraging the capacities of all, but where we are also recognizing, this is important in these times, this interdependency on seed. Back to you, Doa.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Michael. What an excellent expose of how global your industry is, and how long it has taken this industry to develop appropriate standards, the right contracts, ensure the quality necessary, and also just fascinating in your comments how long it takes and the time scale involved in seeds crossing borders and moving from one country to another. The world of seeds is a mystery to me, but I'm sure to a lot of other people too. Fascinating indeed. Thank you for this. I'll turn to you, Naomi, in Australia, before you become even more tired. How has seed trade been impacted first by the COVID pandemic and now by tensions in the Black Sea region? Is the global supply chain resilient and resistant to crises in your view?
Okay, well, I'm not sure about crisis resistance, but I'm passionately enthusiastic about the enormous power of resilience of our agricultural systems, especially starting with the seed and the capabilities of the people who work together through the supply chain to get the seed where it needs to be. But during COVID, world trade for some time pretty much came to a standstill, as we recall. And border closures, unavailable trucks, flights and labour increased logistical costs and limited the export routes. And that further exacerbated then by war, trade flows were even more distorted, whilst farmers grappled with shortages, as we heard, of input materials like fertiliser, fuel, but also peat for plant raisers, and the rising energy costs that have led to changes actually in planting strategies by farmers adapting to these challenges. So the shortages from the disruption to wheat, sunflower, oil supplies from the Ukraine are driving reduced or delayed plantings and a shift in Europe from vegetable production to planting wheat, sunflower, soy, corn, due to the favourable pricing, less risk and lower crop management costs. And last winter, many glasshouses in northwestern Europe remained empty as a result of exorbitant gas prices, which impacted the economic viability of these vegetable crops. So as the industry has become more dynamic and the outlook more uncertain, we must also become more agile, especially as farmers are waiting until the very last moment to decide what their planting strategy will be. Now, we understand how critical to the survival of the Ukrainian agricultural sector is the uninterrupted ability to access quality seeds and farming inputs. And in fact, in preparation of this year's planting season in Ukraine, Bayer's team on the ground showed remarkable resilience, ingenuity and commitment to our partners in the Ukraine and continued to supply farmers with seeds and agricultural inputs in spite of the many challenges. So Bayer also donated more than 40,000 bags of seed to grow food on nearly 30,000 hectares. The seed supported 1,250 small farmers in the Ukraine who had difficulty in accessing the inputs for the 2022 growing season. But there was an OECD study last year that was about the pandemic on impact on global and Asian supply chains. And that actually emphasised that building a more resilient seed supply chain requires policies to ensure the uninterrupted production and movement of seed during lockdowns. Also, the further development of international seed supply chains and the diversification of seed production. So clearly an enabling environment for farmers to access innovation is necessary for food security and sustainable agricultural production. And Bayer, together with the seed sector, are willing participants in these important policy dialogues. And also in 2021, Bayer joined hundreds of seed companies signing a seed sector declaration. And we committed to actively support achievement of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and to proactively demonstrate the extensive and diverse contributions towards sustainable food systems, including key initiatives in progressing seed resilience. And seed resilience is defined by our industry as the adaptability and capacity to contribute to food and nutrition security by making accessible sufficient, diverse, locally adapted, improved, high-quality varieties to all farmers, taking into account environmental health, social and economic aspects. So the fact we can define and demonstrate already our seed sector resilience is a vital start to our journey to become even more agile and adaptable to continual crises. So yes, the seed market is resilient and will be able to withstand crises as it always has. So thank you.
Naomi, thank you very much for this. It's interesting to hear your definition of what resilience for your sector means. And it's, of course, a very complicated definition, adaptability, diversity, local conditions, and so on. So really a lot of challenges in this sector for resilience to be achieved. And you spoke of an enabling environment, and I think we're in an environment that might be the opposite of enabling for a lot of farmers today. You know, you spoke of having planting strategies, of being more agile, and you know, I would really not want to put myself in the shoes of a farmer today who just doesn't know where their fertilizer or seed is going to come from, you know, what how freight, you know, and what freight prices are going to look like in the very near future. So really, we're in a very difficult situation today. Marco, I'd like to turn to you. I'd like you to start, if possible, by describing to viewers what RIC-SWAN does, and then to comment on the global seed supply chain addressed by Michael and Naomi. What would you describe as its weakest links from your standpoint?
Yes, thank you, Doa. First of all, briefly, an explanation about RIC-SWAN. We are a Dutch family-owned breeding company, breeding vegetable varieties. We have approximately 1,500 commercial varieties in our assortment, divided over more than 25 crops. So that already shows quite a lot of diversity. And I will get back to that a bit later when we speak about more details. So movement of seed is crucial for us. And it's good to realize that vegetable seeds specifically are high value and low weight. So what the vegetable seed sector does is making use of the possibilities that nature is offering us. So we find places where we can do breeding. We find places where we can do seed production, where we can do treatments and packings, and then we will find our destination markets. So at RIC-SWAN, we do research and development, for example, in 10 countries. We do seed production in more than 20 countries, and there might not always be overlap. We process our seeds in 3 countries, and selling in more than 100 countries. And for each process, the selection of these countries is really specific, and it differs per crop even. And to give an example, and Michael already elaborated a little bit on this, we might develop a specific melon variety in Spain. We might do subsequently breeding support and basic seed production in Tanzania. Then we would do commercial seed production in Chile, and we would do then thereafter processing and quality control in the Netherlands and sales, for example, in a country like Mexico. Now, this whole cycle might take, especially because of the lengthy time required for breeding, this whole cycle might take between 5 and 10 years. And in another complicating factor, I have to say, in quite some cases, seed production takes place a couple of years before the actual sales take place. So the country of destination is not always known at the moment we do seed production. And as a consequence, we get the required certificates at the moment we do seed productions, but those certificates might not comply with the needs of the countries of destinations at the moment of sales. And this is a challenge that we have to master. Furthermore, the vegetable seed sector in general deals with more than 50 species, so more than 50 crops. And it's, as I said, very often small quantities that we move around the world. And we talk here about pieces, about 500 seeds, 1,000 seeds, sometimes a bit more. And we talk about grams to start seed production or to continue breeding. And it's therefore not always possible to execute certain destructive quality tests or to meet the required sample sizes for testing. So to conclude, and it was already mentioned, in any case, seeds, but definitely vegetable seeds are not just a commodity. And our seeds travel all over the world. Now, coming back to your question, Doa, on the weakest links related to the global vegetable seed trade, is first of all the lack of enabling policies in some countries. And here you can think about IP laws, about seed laws, phytosanitary regulations in certain regions. And this limits the access to markets. And the consequence is, and this is something which we have to solve, is that we are not reaching all farmers in the world that should have the right, to access quality seed of their choice. The second issue is that there is lack of harmonization. You could also say mutual recognition in rules and regulations that are required for a level playing field. Just to give you one example, approximately 80 to 90% of the phytosanitary requirements at crop pathogen level is classified as technically unjustified according to the ISF regulated pest list initiative. And that is based on scientific impact studies. So the demand for seed tests, the demand for certificates is huge and is much, I would say, heavier than what would be technically needed. Last but not least, geopolitical developments, protectionism, foreign direct investment policies, and legal uncertainty very much influence where we are and where we can sell our seed and whether seed can freely move around the world. Back to you, Doa.
Marco, thank you so much for this. So obviously a very global industry, thinking just of the number of countries that your company operates in to process and sell seeds is, I would say, sobering. We have a lot of discussions in the WTO on, as well as in all other fora that discuss food, on the concept of food sovereignty, with a lot of countries in response to these multiple crises saying, we need to relocalize. And I think listening to your intervention just now makes me think just how impossible it is to do so. Our food system is incredibly interlinked at the global level, incredibly globalized. And the best way to secure food security is to strengthen that global value chain that you've just described. also very interesting in your comments that what you've put in the basket of weakest links are all the WTO issues. So that's a lot of work for you, Edwini, and for myself. In that big basket of issues, you've put lack of harmonization, certification, protectionism, lots of work for the WTO indeed going forward. So Alice, let me now turn to you. Food security and seed security are two sides of the same coin. Is there evidence that farmers are in greater difficulty today in accessing seeds relative to the pre-COVID, pre-Black Sea tensions period? And where do smallholder farmers sit in the global seed value chain? Over to you.
Thank you so much, Dora. Speaking, I'll start with the part of where smallholder farmers fall on the global seed value chain. And this is something that we've all been speaking about or hearing a lot. It's a fact that smallholder farmers dominate agriculture in most of the sub-Saharan African countries, in South and Southeast Asia, and also in America, in Latin America mainly. And these farmers, according to FAO, it's the mostly farmers whose land plot are about 2 hectares. And these farmers mostly rely on rainfall, and they are based in rural remote areas where there's usually weaker infrastructure to reach these farmers. And in total, these farmers, they go about more than 600 million farmers, and they contribute to 1/3 of our global food production. And so it's really important to understand that these smallholder farmers, they hold a lot for our food security. And one of the main challenges that farmers still face today is access to the reliable and timely supply of quality seeds. And this is where we see that the private seed sector particularly has a huge role to play. And they should be doing their best and more efforts to ensure that smallholder farmers always have access to quality seeds. And together, different stakeholders, we should be holding the private sector more accountable into this work. And this is what we are doing, particularly from Access to Seeds Index within the World Benchmarking Alliance. We are looking at the seed companies that have the most influence in developing countries where there's high food insecurity and also high yield potential. And we are asking these companies, what are your efforts? And what we see is that companies are recognizing smallholder farmers more and more in their business models. And this is something that we align with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. But again, companies still have a lot more to do in terms of from their governance and structure, and making sure that farmers are included in the business models at the core, and then making sure that the whole process of making sure that the smallholder farmer has quality seed is important. And what we did in 2021, we assessed seed companies again, including some companies here, Bayer, in Rex One. And we are asking these companies how they're doing, especially during the pandemic. And one of the during the COVID pandemic, and one of the main view we saw the trend is that the seed sector was recognized as essential sector in most of the countries, which shows again the importance of the seed. And then companies don't report distribution challenges on their cost, and also delays to reach on the to move their products. And this is what affects smallholder farmers, because they still need to have these seeds in a timely manner, and also they need after-sales support in building their capacity and making sure that they can benefit and maximize from those improved seed, because the goal is to double their food production on a small plot of land, and also be able to increase their food production. So as these challenges continue to move, movement of seed or inputs that are important for smallholder farmers, we need to also hold the seed industry more accountable and making sure that they're doing all their best they should be doing. And we have opportunities to learn from the tools we have, for example, Access to Seeds or other existing tools, and say, well, this is particularly where the challenges are, and this is how we should focus on them, and learn from leading practices of where they exist. So thank you. This is why I wanted to share. Over to you, Dara.
Thank you so much, Alice. It is key, of course, that we get to the smallholder farmer. We're in a global situation where big holders have problems, let alone smallholders. So absolutely, and thank you for spotlighting this. Edwini, I'd like to turn to you. Food security was a major theme at the 12th Ministerial Conference of the WTO. What were the main concerns that countries had going into this conference, and how would you sum up what was achieved?
Thank you, Dora. And I think this discussion is taking place at an opportune time as WTO members are still focused on food security considerations. Most members are of the view that the negotiations that are currently ongoing should deliver on food security. So I think this discussion, as I said, is taking place at a timely time. Clearly, before we had a conference, which had been postponed a couple of times, but there was the lingering issue of the pandemic, which had disrupted food supply chains. There were also tensions, and there's still tensions in the Black Sea region, which is one of the leading bread baskets in the world. And as Maximo just mentioned, serious efforts are underway to get grain out of Ukraine. And I think we are very pleased to see that the situation is beginning to ease, even if there are still some difficulties, like Maximo mentioned, that a greater part is also going to feed, to be for animal feed, and then 55% is only for human beings, and also a very small proportion are going to low-income countries. So we hope that all this will be rectified with time. In addition, the conference also took place against the background of many years of protracted agricultural negotiations at the WTO. You would recall that in 2017 in Buenos Aires, there was no decision on agriculture. And to some extent, apart from the two decisions that members agreed on at MC12, nothing was agreed on the substantive agriculture negotiations. So I'll return to that. So there is a lot of work to be done as far as agriculture is concerned. While the conclusion of the agreement on agriculture way back in 1995 was quite groundbreaking, members were conscious back then that there was still more work to be done. So they committed themselves to negotiate further to improve the disciplines with a view to achieving a fair and market-oriented agricultural trading system. Trade distorting agricultural subsidies currently remain high. According to calculations done by the Keynes Group, they are nearly $1 trillion. And if nothing is done, it will double to $2 trillion by 2030. So it is quite important for WTO to update its rulebook to ensure that countries which are competitive get the opportunity to supply the market, rather than taking into consideration how deep the pockets of a government is. So I think members are focused on that. Agricultural tariffs are also very high. As compared to industrial products, it is twice as high, and that also encourages distortions in the agricultural sector. When we went to MC12, there was also the concern of the proliferation of export restrictions, which I think Maximo pointed, and I think the way you also pointed out, that also impacted. There was that panic, and there were no sufficient grounds for countries to do that. But I think a number of countries imposed export restrictions. According to WTO recent statistics, that those numbers are beginning to come down. So it's a welcome development. So members also committed to use export restrictions sparingly. And I think that's a welcome step, because obviously if we have many, they proliferate, then prices will go up, and that will make it difficult, especially for small countries, small island states, least developed countries, to have access to food. So in summary, there were two major decisions which were achieved in the agricultural space. One was the decision by members, a ministerial declaration on the emergency response to food insecurity, in which members expressed their commitment to facilitating trade in food, fertilizers, and other agricultural inputs, which would obviously include seeds. We already heard from Marco the protectionism and also the lack of standards or lack of harmonization, which impede trade. So clearly, the ministerial declaration spoke to some of these impediments, which have frustrated trade in seeds and other agricultural inputs. They also reaffirmed the importance of not imposing food export restrictions or prohibitions in a manner which would be inconsistent with WTO rules, and they also committed themselves to minimize the trade distortive impact of emergency measures, keeping their response to crisis temporary, targeted, and transparent. There was also the decision on the World Food Programme, in which members committed to exempt purchases by the WFP for humanitarian purposes from the imposition of export restrictions. That decision was welcomed by the WFP, because if there are export restrictions, then it makes it difficult for them to procure food, and it makes it difficult for them to feed as many people as they would have liked to, because obviously we saw that some export restrictions which were imposed actually impacted negatively in terms of higher prices for grains, and that limited the ability of the WFP. So that decision, as I said, has been welcomed by the WFP. Thirdly, there was also a decision on SPS, and I think this discussion has come up in terms of the need to ensure, because the WTO agreement on sanitary and phytosanitary measures makes it quite clear that if members want to impose measures, they have to be based on science and be based on international guidelines or rules where they exist. And I think Marco briefly outlined some of the challenges which have been encountered as far as the seed industry is concerned. So while we basically took these decisions were quite important, we do also acknowledge that there is more work to be done. As I've pointed out, we started the agriculture negotiations way back in 2000. We are in 2022. And there's still no end in sight. We are going to have a retreat on the 24th of October to see how we can actually make progress in the negotiations, because I think for now, the focus of members is on agriculture. After the successful MC12, where we had a decision on trade and health, on fishery subsidies, and the two decisions on agriculture, i.e. food insecurity and WFP, members are rightly focusing their attention on agriculture. And we believe that a vibrant agriculture agreement will go a long way to improving food security in the world. So I think I'll just stop here and hand over back to you, Doa. Thank you very much.
Edwini, thank you very much for this overview. It's great to know, of course, and to share this with our viewers, that there's been a lot of progress made at MC12, and that food security is absolutely in the spotlight at WTO at the moment. And that's a tremendous opportunity to achieve even more. So we really must use that momentum. Thank you very much for this. I will now start the second round of questions, if I may. Maximo, I'd like to come back to you with another broad food security question. The FAO has been urging governments to consider establishing what it calls a global food import financing facility in response to soaring food import costs. Where does this idea stand today, and what would this facility look like? How can countries be supported in accessing not only food, but also fertilizer, agricultural inputs, and seeds?
Thank you very much, Doa. Let me start by saying that this is an issue of great importance for FAO. As I mentioned before, the fact that the world food prices have declined slightly in the last 5 months doesn't mean that they are at low levels. They are extremely high levels. And the challenge is that countries cannot afford food. Affordability is a huge issue. That's why we say that we have a food crisis problem right now, not yet a food availability problem this year. And what this means, it means that there is a significant amount of countries that have incapacity to be able to purchase the food that they normally use to purchase. And because of their balance of payment situations, they cannot be able to get the resources to do this. We have developed the food import financing facility mechanism and design to be able to help those countries. And the facility, what it does is basically identify the most vulnerable 62 countries that have balance of payments problems and that have incurred and are incurring a significant increase in their food import bill. What is the aim? To increase their food access and to smooth the challenge that they are facing right now and the constraints they have for 1 or 2 years until things recover and come back to normal. Second is to assure that they don't reduce the amount of what they import, and especially that they don't reduce significantly the quality of what they import, because of course that will affect their health. It will create a problem of undernutrition or overnutrition, which is something that we want to avoid. And as I mentioned before, this is a big challenge, and we cannot afford countries and consumers of these countries to go through this process, because it could even have a relationship with potential social unrest. Now, in what this FIF consists? The FIF is covering 62 countries, the most vulnerable, is providing all the technical assessment so that this access to resources through grants or loans could help these countries to afford. And we have stress test this mechanism to show that it doesn't create any distortion in the market, given that you are targeting very vulnerable countries. It covers around 1.72 billion people in the world, and has been designed to match and complement the balance of payment facility of the IMF. And while the logic and the structure is the same, because it has to be consistent, the big difference is that the FIF is only targeting food, unlike the balance of payment mechanism, where the coverage of which is much broader. In addition, the FIF should incorporate conditionalities to ensure that resilience will increase in the future, and that there will be no market and trade distortions caused by the support that will be provided to the eligible countries. And let me clarify that the FIF is not for FAO to implement, but rather for IMF to implement. And the good news is that this has been already picked up by the IMF. And if you look at the joint statement that was issued yesterday by the World Bank, the IMF, FAO, WFP, and WTO, essentially IMF is designing their facility. They are calling it a food shock facility, food shock window, which basically brings almost all of the elements that we have designed in this facility, but they are still in the process of discussion, and they will be launching this. So it's really good news that things are moving in that sense. But also it's important to understand that we cannot use one instrument for multiple purposes. So this is an instrument designed for the food import bill, and it's broader to the food and not to wheat and to maize, because wheat and maize are final products or inputs to other products, and indirectly affect, together with the increasing cost of fertilizers, are affecting the price of all food items. That's why we do a food import facility. The second element is this cannot and should not be used to increase support to countries to buy fertilizers, for example, or to buy seeds. Why? Because the problem that we are facing on fertilizers is a supply problem. And therefore, if the supply is shrinking because of the restrictions that we're observing today, and because of the link between natural gas and what is happening in Europe as a result of that, in terms of the closure of fertilizer plants, that means that any shock on the demand side will exacerbate the situation, creating efficiencies that resolve the problem. So for the input side, the solution should be different. The instruments should be different. So what we have been discussing on how to resolve this. In the short term, there is a huge effort from the Secretary General under the Black Sea Initiative to release some fertilizers that will come out immediately for the emergency situation, and this will be handled by WFP. The second element is that there is a lot of effort, and yesterday I was in a meeting in Nunga, where there was an agreement that in addition to the comfort letters of the US to allow fertilizers to flow from Russian Federation, because they are not part of the sanctions, but there were other elements around the SWIFT that were creating risk, and therefore traders were not doing that. Also, Europe will have issued a guideline on how this can be done without violating the sanctions, and is allowing fertilizer to move through Europe out to other countries, not to stay in Europe, that's not allowed, but it's allowed to move fertilizers from Russian Federation to Europe, which was normally the first port of entry, out to other countries. And that they will also will be issuing comfort letters. So these are good news because can reduce the risk and can accelerate the process of mobility of fertilizers from the top exporter in the world, which is Russian Federation, is the first exporter in the world of nitrogen, the second of potassium, and the third of phosphorus. So that is the second emergency element to be able to move fertilizers out. Then there is a look at the efficiency gains and how we can gain efficiencies in terms of the use of fertilizers. And for that, we are deploying, with the support of the US, nutrition soil maps that will allow us to immediately come up in the most short term possible with blending recommendations so that farmers can use this in the more efficient way. And there is, of course, significant support from IFIs to try to facilitate also the fertilizer, which is produced in some regions, like in Africa, for example, the Dangote plant, which can satisfy significant amount of the demand of Africa, but most of the fertilizer is going right now to Latin America, to South America. So how we can resolve those bottlenecks. So those are really targeting solutions on the supply side that will allow us to resolve that. And the same, of course, will apply to seeds, because it's important to understand that the seed sector is also a highly concentrated sector in terms of the bigger exporters, which are coming on the seed sector, and therefore we need to mainstream that. No, so Netherlands, France, and the USA are the major ones. And why seeds are so important in this issue is because under the situation that we are facing of stresses of climate, of high temperatures, flooding, like what is happening in Pakistan, and variability of climate, we need to have a good seed sector, certified seeds that comply with all the requirements, that have harmonization, that cover phytosanitary and varietal issues, so that we can have access and farmers can have access, and then so that we increase the resilience also under situations of climate shock. So again, just to summarize, we need to have instruments for each of the different problems, because if not, given that the source of the problem is different, we could create an additional distortion, which is the last thing that we want. And that's why we need to be very careful on how these policies are being implemented. Back to you.
Thank you very much for this, Maximo. Excellent overview of this potential food importing facility. And very useful to know that you believe that inputs need a more targeted approach and a different approach. So that's all very helpful. Naomi, I'd like to come back to you and to zoom in on sanitary and phytosanitary measures, SPS measures, as we often call them. Conflicting SPS measures and the insufficient harmonization of standards at an international level creates problems for seed trade. Can you walk us through Bayer's experience with this issue, giving concrete examples if possible?
Yes, and we certainly want to share our experience and support the SPS Committee's work on facilitating agricultural trade and ensuring farmers' access to innovative tools while encouraging sustainable practices. So the 38th International Standard for Phytosanitary Movement of Seeds, that ISPM 38, released in 2017, recognises seed should be considered in its own right. But after 5 years, there is still much to do to implement this important international standard in many countries, especially when it comes to regulating pests of seed. And Marco mentioned this as well. Trust between the plant pest regulators is key. So if an exporting country certifies the seed to be free from a pest, the importing authority should not need to retest routinely for the same pest. Authorities should also recognise that equivalent measures to mitigate phytosanitary risks and facilitate harmonisation. So Bayer works in around 30 different seed crops and in about 160 countries. This generates millions of shipping documents, testing and field inspection requirements. And these seeds are currently subject to a patchwork of requirements for SPS. And we are concerned about this, especially as we see the trend is more testing for more pests, adding more uncertainty and cost, which ultimately adds risk to food security. So over the 180 pests are actually regulated on tomatoes worldwide. This is an example, and 80% of those we believe to be non-science based. So either the seed is not a known pathway or tomato is not even a host of the pest of concern. And new pathogens are added constantly by countries, which may or may not be notified to SPS and only revealed when triggered by an import permit application. So the global seed industry keeps a comprehensive regulated pest list, which Bayer strongly supports, as this is an essential tool to enable seed movement and without the risks, as it actually identifies the relevant seed pests. But back to tomatoes, where a gram of seeds can be worth more than its equivalent weight in gold, and the current experience with tomato brown rugose fruit virus. So since 2020, there are 24 countries that have implemented various regulations for this plant pathogen with different requirements. And that includes laboratory testing, in-field testing, and declaring areas free from the pest. Some countries require mandatory testing prior to export and retesting upon arrival. And different sample sizes of seed are required for testing, ranging from 3,000 to 4,600 or 20,000 seeds. So many of these new regulations impacted the ability for us to sell our seed inventory because of insufficient lead time to meet the requirements. But during the pandemic, we experienced some progressive approaches to ensuring seed could move. And for a short time, many countries accepted PDF copies rather than originals of phytosanitary certificates out of necessity. Electronic phytosanitary certificates use increased, and virtual field inspections were also successfully utilised in some countries. But if only these approaches could continue and expand the use of these electronic tools. So the Bayer teams have worked with governments around the clock to secure seed supplies under crisis conditions, but we don't expect the extent of effort, this effort is afforded by all seed companies. So the global seed trading operations definitely rely on timely communication, on trust and transparency of phytosanitary requirements to protect plant health and ensure international, unrestricted and safe trade of seeds. And that's why we strongly encourage the transparent, predictable, science-based regulations that facilitate effective trade, accelerated adoption of international standards with e-phyto solutions, and increased partnering with the seed industry to better use resources and understand our processes. Back to you, Doa.
Thank you very much, Naomi, for this. I think probably prior to the pandemic, some of us would have had trouble relating, some of us non-experts, on the seed sector would have had trouble relating to what you're describing of testing prior to departure, testing upon arrival. But now that we have experienced how difficult it was for us as humans to move during the COVID pandemic, with us being tested prior to departure and prior to arrival in international travel, we just have to understand and to imagine that this is what happens to your product whenever it travels prior to the pandemic, during, and now. So, we sympathize, and obviously some major challenges there. Thank you for highlighting them. I'd like to come to you, Marco, now. In order to develop new varieties and supply top quality seeds, Brick Swan sees continuous innovation as essential. In fact, my understanding is that 40% of your employees are involved in research and development, an area which you invest around 30% of your annual turnover in. How important are intellectual property rights for you, and what obstacles do you face in this area?
Yeah, thank you, Doa. Intellectual property rights are extremely relevant to us, but we have to be a bit more specific in our industry. We are talking about plant breeders' rights, and plant breeders' rights are a specific right dedicated or developed especially for plants, and they offer the right holder of a variety protection against reproduction by third parties without consent. And simultaneously, it allows other breeders to develop new varieties and new varieties that are distinct. And the result is, in fact, an incentive for breeders like us, but also a kind of combination with open source innovation. And that leads to quicker development of new, better adapted varieties with higher yields, more resistances, etc. Now, UPOV is the International Union for the Protection of New Varieties of Plants. And this organization has currently 78 countries that are member. And here we see the following challenges, I would say, obstacles. There are still quite some countries that are not member, right? 78 is not every country, or is not the whole world. And yet there are countries as a consequence that have no or poorly functioning IPR legislation in place. And in those cases, our material as a breeding company is not protected. And for us, that might be a reason, not always, but it might be a reason not to further develop varieties and seeds for those countries. Secondly, the UPOV 91 Act contains some important improvements over the 71 version. amongst others, the obligation to facilitate plant breeders' rights for all crops. And in general, UPOV 91 offers in general, a broader protection. But the implementation of this act goes slow. The consequence is lack of harmonization. We see different levels of protection, different application procedures, and different requirements per country. Now, there is an online application tool recently developed and also more and more used for the application of plant breeders' rights. And that's definitely an improvement towards harmonization, but still no guarantee that countries use the same data or work with the same procedures. And as a result, protection becomes more and more complex and expensive. There is another comment I would like to make here, which is for the breeding sector really relevant, and that is the access to genetic resources for further breeding. Breeding plays a major role in improving food and nutrition security worldwide. But it can only do so when the breeding companies have access to rich genetic resources that nature is offering us. And this plant material could have traits that are interesting for both growers and consumers. And think here about resistances against pests and diseases, or better resilience under difficult climate conditions. And this huge diversity in plant genetic resources that provides an important opportunity for us plant breeders to develop new and improved varieties. And of course, we are fully aware of our responsibility to contribute to ensuring food security in times when the impact of climate change, pests, diseases, and other stress are increasing. But access and benefit sharing to those genetic resources is a complicated topic. To get permission for collection missions, to get access to material from gene banks or material we obtain from growers in seed shops, we are maintaining close contacts and relations with governments. And although much is going well, there is always room for improvement. So we should share knowledge and understand from each other the legal framework in certain countries. Sometimes there are very complicated procedures, and basically the rules are not even available in English. We have to share mutual expectations, and we have to create a better understanding, I have to say also. There's homework for us of the contribution that seed companies are making to worldwide food security by having access to genetic diversity. Seed multiplication for local gene banks, this is what we do. We analyze and describe traits for public use. We do voluntary contributions, and that is also, I think, very crucial to mention. Just through the creation of new varieties, we are increasing biodiversity. So hopefully this international treaty on plant genetic resources for food and agriculture will be further improved, enhancing access against reasonable terms. The last obstacle or challenge, Doa, is the fact that related to intellectual property rights, illegal seed and counterfeit practices are an increasing concern. Copying, theft of parental lines, falsification of packagings, which undermines the integrity of the seed sector, is really an increasing concern. Probably Michael can elaborate a bit further on that. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Marco, for this. Obviously, without proper intellectual property protection, seed trade would certainly struggle. Seed production, research and development would certainly struggle. So it's in everybody's interest that proper protection be established so that people can continue to innovate in a sector where innovation is absolutely vital. Michael, I'd now like to come to you. We heard from Naomi about the SPS issues. We just heard from Marco about the TRIPS issues or intellectual property issues. I'd like you to take us to a third nexus of issues that I think is very important, which is illegal trade in seeds. Illegal seeds are a growing worldwide issue, which poses a significant threat to the livelihood of farmers and to global food security. Illegal seed practices also carry intellectual property implications, reduce farmers' access to products from reputable producers, and so on. What can you tell us about this problem?
Yeah, thanks so much, Dora. Allow me just to say also, because Maximo mentioned partnering, cooperation, enabling business environments, and you heard from Naomi and Marco, is it perhaps we're at the beginning of the whole value chain that we have a lot of regulation we have to cope with? We're not complaining about regulations. What we are just looking for is that they're predictable and science-based. I think that's really important. That's also a reminder to where I started from 1924 on. And now some of you asked me a spotlight on a topic, and I'm very happy that the UTO is asking us another spotlight, not only on seed, but even on illegal seed practices. Just yesterday, when I opened LinkedIn, I was and don't ask me names of countries, because all countries are concerned. It's not here name dropping. I just discovered the story of an NGO in Africa mentioning in a given country in Africa, 40% of agricultural inputs and mostly seed are counterfeited, just yesterday. And this is a systemic challenge, including inequity, regulatory framework, undercapitalized seed producers, poor policy implementation. Absolutely of big importance and actuality. Second, World Bank report on enabling business in agriculture, 2017, mentioned 50% of crop seeds sold in given countries are counterfeited. In an internal, non-representative, and I'm existing, non-representative survey we made with our members some years back, it is clear that the majority of crops and the majorities of countries are confronted with illegal seed practices. And we are saying it could be in some countries, on some crops, 40% of the market. Let me give you just some examples. What could this be? This can be, we have 30% of countries in Southern Europe, for instance, where there can be issues with theft of parental lines and vegetative propagation of vegetable hybrids. We have brown bagging. What means this? This means grain harvested from hybrids and is misrepresented and sold as genuine hybrid seed for sowing. We have mislabelings of packages. That means you see a multitude of issues facing on the ground related to illegal seed practices. A point I would like to make is these practices are very commonly connected with criminal activities. I think that's also an important point, such as tax evasion, fraud, corruption, and even labor exploitation. And by this has a negative impact also on the society. I will come very quickly also, because that's the key for us, on the farmers. As a private sector, it's a top priority for us to engage with all. And we would be happy to engage also with the World Trade Organization on this topic. Only together, by partnering, we can handle this issue. Because what are the reasons behind? First, social factors in countries. Second, lack of awareness also of appreciations of the plant breeders' work and the sustainability of our work. Recession, low income, and relatively easy to organize. But then we have also legislative shortcomings. We have ignorance of applicable regulations and technical aspects. And even when you have the right regulation, and even if you have the right enforcement, it can be ridiculous. At the end, the fine you get can be a couple of €100. You see, diversity of topics also where the governments are asked to work together also with us. And then we have also an issue with low risk. Pharmaceutical counterfeiting, food counterfeiting, yes, there's harm, direct harm also on human health. Tobacco, alcoholic beverages, yes, big losses, tax revenue. Seed sector, sometimes politically misunderstanding. It's seen as, only some companies, perhaps only the big ones are concerned. No, this is a misinterpretation, because all breeders who are unable to recover on their investment and can build sustainable business models are suffering from this situation. Nurseries are suffering from this. Consumers also can suffer from this, because can be a lower or fake quality of the tomato you're eating, for instance. But now I'm coming to those who are suffering the most. And therefore, I think this is a call to WTO, but also FAO and others. Those who are suffering the most are the farmers. And like Alice mentioned, smallholder farmers. You have the money to buy one bag of seed, perhaps per year, a smallholder farmer with 0.5 hectares. And you're buying this bag because you're thinking, I buy this certified seeds because I get the outcome. I get the livelihood, I can pay for my children's school, and I can make some money to even increase. And then you're buying crap. That's the end of the story. That's when it comes about livelihood. But then it comes also about what we spoke about, food security. And I think this we should have in mind when we are speaking about illegal seed practices. It's serious. And it's so serious that we should partner all together to address this topic. Back to you, Doa.
Michael, thank you very much for this. Indeed, this is a very important topic, and our Director General, Dr. Ngozi, is very interested in the issue of illegal trade and thinks that the WTO should become more vocal on the issue, given that we have a variety of different instruments in the WTO rulebook that can be leveraged in the war against illegal trade. We have a pre-shipment inspection agreement, we have a customs valuation agreement, we have an intellectual property agreement. So, we would be very happy to work with you on this topic and to take this issue forward. Alice, I'd like to come to you and to turn to the dynamics of the seed industry. Seed movement has historically been north-south, but today we're seeing more south-south movements. Are there any trade policy measures that you could point to that could enhance south-south investment in trade and seeds?
Thank you, Doa. And yes, I can confirm that also from our work on what we do with Access to Seeds Index, historically, we have seen that south-south seed trade and investment is increasing. And historically, that's compared to like north-south, where most of the seed companies were bringing varieties that needed to be tested and also bred further so that they can be suitable for local conditions. But if you look at companies from the southern continents, they are moving into other southern regions where usually the climatic conditions are relatively similar. And these are examples we have where we see some companies from Asia like Advanta in India or Thailand, where we see East-West, and these companies are moving more into Africa and also Latin America. We also see, particularly in India, where many companies are moving into sub-Saharan Africa. And then from African side, there's few companies that are still moving, for example, just like Seedco, which is just moving from Africa to India or Pakistan. So this is definitely something that is emerging. And what we see as some of the measures that have been important on our side is collaborations with national seed trade associations. These associations, they play a big role in making sure that they're enabling and supporting trade policies, both from the private sector and also collaboration with governments. And as I mentioned, some great examples we can learn from is like India or Thailand, where we see that they, for example, the Federation of Seed Industry of India, they are looking at the government goals and including them in their goals to increase global supply of seed from 1% to 10%. And they're making sure that also financial support is going to more crops that are actually important for smallholder farmers rather than the commercial products. We see also in Thailand, where, for example, the Thai Seed Trade Association is working with the government to have like a one-stop center where like all the information is shared, all the protocols around like certifications is shared, and they're working with the government. So these are really great examples that show you that complements and the collaboration at the national level supports movement of seed in the region and also supporting international movement of seed. And so this allows movement of also innovation, because we see that South and Southeast Asia is really advancing in their research and development. And this is allowing us to have access to more quality seeds that are also responding to challenges in climate change. And then in addition to that, also there's affordability that comes with those that kind of trade that allows farmers to still have access to quality and improved seed varieties. Over to you, Doa. That's what we see.
Thank you very much, Alice. Great to hear that a lot of this is happening, and that, in fact, as you said, the movement of seeds is the movement of innovation and is increased affordability, and that indeed this is vital to combating climate change. Thank you. Edwini, I'd like to come to you. You've now heard from fellow panelists about their IP, SBS, and other concerns. What can you tell us about how the WTO rulebook, including the Agreement on Agriculture itself, can promote trade in seeds?
Thank you, Doa. And I think it is very clear from the presentations. I think all of them have underscored the importance of the rules-based multilateral trading system for the seed sector. And as you rightly pointed out, a number of WTO agreements impact on seed trade. So starting with the Agreement on Agriculture, I think it's quite clear that seeds feed into the agricultural production process. So the more we disrupt or distort trade in agriculture, we inadvertently also disrupt and distort trade in seeds. So it's very important for the playing field to be leveled, for distortions to be reduced, and that would impact positively on trade in seeds. So that is one. The SPS agreement, I think, has come up. We have seen the lack of standards, the lack of harmonization, and how that can impede trade in seeds. So I think that is also another agreement which is of key relevance to trade in seeds. As I had mentioned before, the SPS agreement is quite clear in that it provides that members are obliged to base their regulations in science and sound risk assessment and to harmonize their regulations with international standards whenever they exist. The more we depart from that, then obviously it would complicate trade in seeds. I would also expect that the recent declaration, which was adopted at MC12 in June, would also impact positively. The declaration makes mention of things like climate change, and the discussions are also starting or ongoing on sustainable growth and innovation. And I think if we are able to level the playing field, we could expect seeds to travel more smoothly to different climatic zones for which they can easily be adapted. I think the point was made by Alice, even if it's south-south or south-north trade, the fact that if you do not have to use a lot of resources to adapt, or they can easily be, it saves farmers money, particularly in developing countries where resources are quite scarce. Another perspective is that the global seed supply chain also requires balanced and robust rules on intellectual property. The WTO agreement on TRIPS, we have seen not only in the area of trade and health, we have seen how the agreement, although it is quite strict, but there are flexibilities embodied in the agreement. And a key example was not only the decision in 2001, but just last June that members were able to come to agreement on trade and health. The agreement is designed basically to protect ideas or research and development embodied in goods that are internationally traded, which would include seeds. We heard the importance of that, even for importing countries or for smallholder farmers. If they do not have access to the right seeds, it can reduce yields and also potentially could also cause harm. So it is very important for the TRIPS agreement also to be implemented by countries. We heard about the plant breeders' right, and obviously the TRIPS agreement and UPOF, all of that coexist in order to give protection to intellectual property rights. There are also other WTO agreements which are relevant. We have the Trade Facilitation Agreement, which slashes red tape, reduces costs, very important for farmers, particularly smallholder farmers. We also have services, the Services Agreement, which is also important, the movement of people, the logistical aspects. So the Services Agreement is also quite important. Doa also did mention about illicit trade, and internally here at the WTO Secretariat, we have begun to look at how the WTO rulebook in its entirety can be leveraged to combat illicit trade, not just in seeds, but across the board. There is no doubt agreements like the pre-shipment inspection, customs valuation can make an important contribution. So I think I'll just stop here and give it back to you, Doa. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all of you. We have 10 minutes remaining, and we have a lot of questions from viewers. So I'd like to ask you to be extremely brief as I field those to you. Michael, I'll just start with you. A viewer is asking about digitalization in the seed sector, how digitalization can facilitate cross-border trade. Do you see any role for the WTO trade facilitation agreement in just helping seeds move faster?
Yeah, first of all, I think I would like to highlight here, we have some concrete cooperations also with STDF on facilitating seed trade also in Asia. I think that's absolutely important. Naomi made an important point. This digitalization, I think for us, for phytosanitary certificates, for instance, it's a very important one. It's a crucial one. That we can move from this paperwork to digitalized world, but this would need also this recognition. I think here digitalization is absolutely essential, will help us to increase trade. But I think also the digitalization, I'm thinking on the farmers, also the relationship between the seed sector and seed actors with the farmers through digitalization to help the farmers concretely on the ground with integrated solution. It's absolutely essential. And I think also all the opportunities we have now with digitalization, also by understanding, using it for genomes and all this, it's impressive, it's massive. I think there are huge opportunities for all of us, and I hope we can use this also in future and also for trade. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. Maximo, many questions to you. I'll just field two, given the time constraint. First, on the Black Sea Grain Initiative, a viewer is asking whether that will be replicated to fertilizer and where we are in that process. And second, another question on the FAO food price index that is declining, with a viewer saying, is this trickling down at country level? Is this really happening in every country? Where he's writing from, food prices are only going up, he says.
Thank you. On the first element, the initiative, the Black Sea Initiative, had two agreements, one between Ukraine and Turkey, and the other one between Russian Federation and Turkey. And that agreement incorporates also mobility of fertilizers, and that's something that is being worked out. As I said before, there is right now detailed working process to move around 300,000 metric tons of fertilizers, but mostly for emergency situation. And then, of course, with the facilitation provided by the comfort letters of the US, and now by the guidelines provided by the European Union and the potential comfort letters that should be coming soon, that will facilitate the mobility of fertilizers out of Russian Federation, and therefore there is not even the need to use the agreement. They can go automatically out as discussed. Of course, you need to move the vessels out, and that's where the agreement plays a role to protect the vessels not being affected by the conflict. So that's the situation right now. The agreement will continue to move more grain out, has accelerated in the last days. So that's good news in terms of food availability. But again, the challenge is food access. And in the case of fertilizers, this needs to happen now because of the planting season. If we don't accelerate this process now, it will create a significant problem for the next planting season. And although sub-Saharan Africa only consumes around 3% of the fertilizers in the world, the impact of that reduction of that 3% could be significant in terms of food security. So we need to be very careful on that. Regarding the second question on how much what we observe in the overall food price index of FAO, the decline of the last 5 months percolated at the country level, I think the transmission it takes time. Why? Because the inputs of the prices which are going down, which is basically wheat and also sunflower oil or oil seeds, because of removal of export restrictions, those are mostly inputs of other products, and therefore that processing, if countries have already procured, they will have to change inventory. So it will take some time for prices to start to percolate down. But remember also that the prices, especially in food importing countries, are also linked to exchange rate and the devaluation of the exchange rate because you import. And the devaluation of the exchange rate will continue because of the fiscal policies being imposed by the monetary policies, the restrictive monetary policies being imposed by US and Europe, basically by increasing the Fed interest rates. you are reducing the amount of dollars in the economy, and therefore you are pushing more for the devaluation of local currencies. And that's a challenge that will also move in parallel and could also be affecting the food inflation that we are facing right now. So still, the food access problem will continue this year, potentially next year. The major concern right now is food availability, especially on rice. We want to minimize any potential effect on rice, which have been doing great right now. But with the Pakistan being affected, which is the fourth exporter in the world of rice, plus some export restrictions being put up on a key exporter of rice, that could exacerbate the situation, plus the affordability issue of fertilizer. So that those are the elements. The situation is not good, it's pretty serious, and we need to emphasize and accelerate distribution of fertilizers, accelerating mobility of vessels out of the Black Sea to assure that we have food availability next year. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maximo. Naomi and Marco, a question from a viewer, the same question directed to both of you, and I guess I'll start with Naomi, ladies first. What is your relationship with the WTO? Do you have a relationship? Does your company have a relationship with WTO? Is the WTO serving your interests?
Yes, thank you, Doa. Yes, we do closely follow the activities of WTO, certainly watching with interest the outcomes of the recent MC12 and supportive of the declarations, particularly around innovation and agriculture. So yes, to keep it short, it's the answer is yes, it's very important. And also recall talking about WTO 20 years ago in terms of technical barriers to trade, so and the introduction of GMO crops in Australia. So a long history of working closely with these instruments.
Marco.
Yes, in fact, we don't have a real direct link in the way Naomi is describing it, although we follow notifications, of course, very precisely because they impact our daily business with high pace. But it's good also to mention that we are a member of national seed associations, regional seed associations, and of course the ISF. And through those associations, there is good interaction on these things, and so we get a lot of input on the developments that take place at WTO and how they can help us further.
Thank you. Alice, a very quick question to you. A viewer is asking if you had to identify the region and the product that is struggling the most with seeds as a result of the current multiple crises. What would that region and what would those products be?
Thank you, Doa. Referencing to our work we did in 2021 Access to Seeds Index, I would point out to Western and Central Africa, just because we don't have a clear picture of what companies are doing there in reality, but also companies have reported that it's more difficult in terms of investing there. And also when you look at indicators of how they're performing on our methodology, we find that there's still more work to be done in that region. However, there's really a lot of work that is done in terms of improving local seed sector, and that is really something that we can also learn from the region on how the local seed sector can support the global seed sector as well. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Edwini, last question. A viewer is asking about net food importing developing countries in the WTO. How is the WTO paying attention to their specific needs?
Thank you. Basically, there is a decision on net food importing countries and least developed countries, and in the recent declaration, there is a specific provision that their needs or their concerns would have to be taken into account. We have just begun a work program in the Committee on Agriculture. There has been agreement on that, and they are in the process of elaborating on the work program to see how best we could address the concerns of these countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, we are right on time. It is 3:30 p.m. in Geneva. I want to thank you all profusely for the time you've dedicated to this program. I myself have been enlightened. I have learned more than I could have possibly imagined about the seed sector, and I am sure that viewers are equally grateful. So a big thank you to you all. The recording will stay on our website for future viewership. Big thank you, and we'll stay in touch. Goodbye. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.